Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today we're going to be discussing advanced remote video production with SRT. That's a big long title, but this is actually a really exciting topic, especially given the current circumstances with physical distancing. Remote things have become really important, whether it's just remote meetings or, of course, remote production now. So we want to cover some of the things to consider and to look at and some of the tools you can use to accomplish that. Seeing people still joining us. So hello to everyone. I see a bunch of people in chat, a couple people from Indiana and places like that saying hi. So feel free to say hi in chat. We will have time for questions at the end of our discussion and presentation. So any questions that you have while we go through, there is a Q&A panel in Crowdcast just down at the bottom. Just click that to open it and ask your questions in there. And there is also an upvote function in the Q&A panel, very Reddit style thing. So if you see someone else's question that seems particularly relevant to you and you want to add some weight to it, use the upvote. That will give it a little more priority so that when Dave and I get to reading through those, we can see that. So lots of people saying hi now. People from Hawaii, ooh, a little bit jealous there.
Yeah.
California, Toronto, Canada, the UK, Colorado, and someone in Ottawa as well. So hello to local people as well, the Netherlands. So this is awesome. Jim also asking there quickly, probably the number one most common question we get in all of these webinars is, will this be recorded for on-demand watching later? Yes. All of the webinars we've been doing for the past 4 months, 4.5 months,
About that, yeah.
all of them are available after the fact on both our website at epiphan.com/webinars and on our YouTube channel. So if you can't join us for the entire time today, totally understand. You can definitely look at that later on in VOD and check that out. So definitely there. And of course, the back catalog, like I said, for the past 4+ months is there as well. So you can go back and look at any of the other topics we've been discussing in all of these times. And hopefully there's something there interesting for you. So numbers are still climbing here a bit. So I'll give it a few more seconds just to see if that jumps in. A few more people saying hi in chat. A couple more people from California and Toronto and Florida, Spain, Croatia, Texas, all over the place. This is awesome. Very, very diverse group of viewers today. So that's great to see.
Awesome. I see we got our first poll up already. We want to know what sector are you a part of? So what industry, are you a live event person? You got corporate interests, education? We just want to know kind of what area you're from. It helps us to really figure out who it is we're talking to and frame some of the discussion in the examples. So do pop over to the poll section there and answer the first one. Just let us know what sector you're part of.
Absolutely. And just a reminder for Q&A, put it in the Q&A panel. The polls panel has a separate part, so don't respond to the polls in the chat. Put it in the actual poll section and weigh in on those. We'll have a number of polls throughout, and we'll try to shout those out when we post them. And Richard was just asking here, we're going to get started in just a second, but Richard was just commenting here, very crisp broadcast. Are you guys in the same location? If you mean, are we in the same city? Kind of. But no, we are not at all in the same location. And that is actually really what today is all about. So again, today we're talking about advanced remote video production with SRT. And that is exactly what Dave and I are doing today. We're going to break that down a little bit for you. So any questions you have, throw them into the Q&A panel, weigh in on the polls as those come up, and we will discuss all of that as we go forward. But I think we're good to get going here. So let's talk a little bit about our agenda today and the different sections that we want to talk about. So kind of going to break this down into 4 parts. So
Yeah.
The first one would be elements of advanced remote video production. Second one would be SRT and how to use it within remote production. And then, of course, we want to talk about how SRT works with Epiphan Pearl systems, which is kind of an important part to how we do things. And then we'll get to your Q&A.
Yeah.
And I do see some people putting questions in the Q&A panel, so that's awesome. Keep those coming. And again, if you see other people's questions, use the upvote button, and that way it adds a little more weight to it. So let's jump into the first section here.
Yeah, so first we want to define what we mean by advanced video production, just to kind of set the context so that the examples we give and the discussion we have kind of make some sense. And really what we mean by advanced is, beyond webcams and kind of USB mics and that kind of thing. So where you're trying to create a very professional, almost broadcast level quality of production, and progress, people talk about professional grade video. That's really what we're after. And as George mentioned, especially these days, being able to do that remotely. So being able to produce that kind of content and in that kind of quality from a remote location, having remote guests even join the broadcast. We're going to go through all of those things. But that's what we mean by advanced. So certainly it's super convenient to just open your phone and you use the camera in your phone and the microphone in your phone to quickly stream live. But we're talking about someone who's trying to give a little bit more of a polished production in what they put forth. So that's really what we're after today.
Absolutely. And I mean, webcams are great for certain basic things like meetings, but when we start getting into video production, they have limitations. And, from the last time I looked, they're also still extremely difficult to get at the moment in terms of stock and pricing and things like that. So, you may want to look at using other cameras you may already own that'll get you that professional grade look. And so we'll kind of look at that. So that setup, again, it's remote, people in different locations, hopefully using a pro grade camera. This could be things like PTZ cameras or mirrorless DSLRs, that kind of thing, even micro four thirds in many cases. This can really give us much more flexibility of the space and how we set up the camera, the lighting conditions, and everything like that. May also involve maybe using multiple cameras, especially if we're talking about a studio space where we're going to shoot a larger production, even remotely. We might have multiple camera angles, so we might need to run all that into a video switcher of some kind, to use those multiple inputs, different layouts for mixing and switching, just to kind of complete the overall look and feel of our production. An audio mixer, that's an important one as well. And funny enough, it's maybe one of the biggest challenges actually. And we do actually have some people commenting that, Dave, you and I, our audio is slightly off. And that's honestly one of the ultimate challenges for a lot of reasons. And we can kind of touch on that a little later. But audio mixers are one of those things that there's not a lot of them that are remotely controllable. So that's something you need to choose wisely. There are some out there, but having some sort of, network-based control or being able to extend some sort of local control panel remotely is definitely something you want to look at and consider if a mixer is an important part of your configuration.
Yeah, there are a lot of them that you can find that will have, iPad controller, that kind of thing, which is meant for kind of remote control, but in the room. And really what you need is something across the network. So you really need to be able to extend that to the remote producer. And that's where very few of them offer that kind of option very easily. So be careful when you're looking for a remote controlled mixer. That remote means across a network, not just on a tablet that's on the very same subnet as where your gear is sitting.
Absolutely. The other one that's kind of in a similar vein actually is lighting. This is something, again, maybe you don't always need it, and there have been some questions about the lighting differences between Dave and I. And again, we can touch on those questions a little later and explain the differences between our setups. But again, if you're maybe looking at a larger studio type environment, you might want to look at remotely controlling lighting as well. There are lighting panels that are network capable. They use DMX protocol typically. Again, something that's really designed for a local network typically, but if you can find the right tools, whether it's, VPNs or other remote desktops or whatever other tools you might need to essentially become part of the local network, and then use whatever software tools you might need to control the lighting. That's some of the things you probably want to consider for your toolkit as well, and make sure that that's just in case you need to tune it up a bit. You're not always in perfect lighting conditions, or maybe lighting conditions are variable, but there's lots of things there you need to consider. So one of the ways I guess we can look at that, this is a very basic diagram, but really we're talking about remote spaces and very likely a remote producer. One of the things, so I think here, I guess we're doing this right now.
Yeah, very much right now. So Cameron is our producer today, and he's at his home, and he's about, I don't know, 30 kilometers away from me. And I'm in my home, and I'm another 30 kilometers away from where George is at his home. So we're all spread out, and the production's being done completely remotely. So it does come with its own challenges, but it can be done. And we've had a little bit of practice, so you do have to kind of, try it on and work out the quirks. But once you kind of settle into a good kind of systematic approach, it works quite well. And SRT is a big part of how we get the level of quality that we've got now going. And when we first started this, when we first started working at home back in March, we didn't have this level of quality. We weren't using SRT, and it made a big difference when we moved to SRT. And so today we really want to share a lot of those kind of details with everyone and get your productions moving in that same direction.
Absolutely. And again, one of the reasons why you might want to consider this is that doing a single person production can be a challenge. So if you're tasking your talent to also produce themselves and have quality content overall without the ums and ahs and gaps and hold on a seconds and those kind of things, having a dedicated producer, it's no different than if it's in person. It's going to be better and flow better and have more control if you have a dedicated producer. The challenge, of course, is that normally you'd be in the same room and having that producer is no big deal. But if that's not currently possible, getting that remote producer is a challenge. And especially because, technology's had to play a lot of catch up in the past little while to really make this possible. It wasn't something that a year ago people were really thinking a lot about. We here at Epiphan have been thinking about it for a few years, but the industry as a whole wasn't really thinking about it. It was just assumed everyone could always be in a traditional kind of studio setup with directors and producers everywhere. So that's, but now we do have to think about this, and not just temporarily. I think a lot of this is going to stick around, and in a good way, in the sense that I think it's going to open up a lot of possibilities as we leverage this more. And we have seen that, we have some examples to discuss on that, but there's quite a number of fronts where using this remote production element is kind of the way I think a lot of things are going to continue into the future.
Yep. And here we draw this picture, just the remote production going to, the workspace or the production space. So that producer is remote, and then we're sending to a CDN from there. And so in our implementation, Cameron's at home, but none of the actual video is flowing through Cameron's home network. That's all. He's just remotely controlling the studio network that sits in our office. So Cameron is controlling all of that gear that's in the studio. And today, neither George or I are in the studio, so we're contributing feeds into the studio. And then, of course, that's being sent on, in this case, to Crowdcast. But there's a whole range of different CDN providers that, are very popular among our users. Everything from Facebook Live and YouTube, Twitch, to more kind of business-oriented products like Streamshark and Video and IBM Cloud, which was the Ustream service of the past. Wowza, and then of course more in the education space, but also in some commercial spaces, the Kaltura Panopto, where it's not only providing the CDN portion, the reach to the end customer in real time, but also the content management for users to come and serve themselves for that VOD recording that you're making of the live broadcast. So there's a whole range there. And if you're, not locating the studio portion directly in your home, which we kind of don't recommend, you want to be somewhere with a very stable, good internet. That's how we're doing it. So we're pushing to Crowdcast today, so that you guys can view it through Crowdcast, and that gives us our polls and our Q&A and all that other stuff. So there's great kind of services that come with that Crowdcast. But it's a very, very simple setup once we kind of break it down.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, choosing which one of these, which CDN is going to be appropriate for your use that's going to vary tremendously depending on what you're trying to accomplish, the type of content you're creating. Of course, using the social media ones, like you mentioned, Dave, like Facebook and YouTube, are extremely popular for anything that's public, partially because they're free and they're easy to reach. Today, I don't know if anyone else was watching it, but I caught a little bit of it. Samsung did one of their big Unpacked events with some product launches today, and it was streamed simultaneously on Facebook and YouTube. It's obviously where their audience is. They're getting hundreds of thousands of viewers between the two platforms. It's a great way to reach audiences if you're looking for a public thing. But not everyone is looking for a public thing. It might be internal or maybe just between business to business, and you might want to look at the more professional paid CDNs that are going to give you those different options. And there's lots of options, of course, out there. What's going to suit you the most is going to depend on specifically what you need, maybe even some rules and regulations that your business has and the corporation has. So we do have a new poll up as well, asking the question, have you used SRT? I suppose part of that would be, how familiar are you with what even SRT is, which kind of brings us to a little bit of our next section, I suppose.
Yes. So the next section is really, we're going to start to dive into SRT and particularly SRT for remote production. So it stands for secure, reliable transport. The security part we touched on earlier is that encryption. It is a very reliable transport. It not to get too deep in the weeds here, but it does kind of replace a traditional transport layer in your network stack. So it's designed for video transport from the ground up, and that's kind of what makes it different or special, and gives you a fair amount of control around latency and quality and that kind of thing. It gives you the ability to trade those things off in a way that most of the existing protocols that it replaces, like RTMP, just don't give you that flexibility and even the feedback just to know how well is that RTMP feed actually working. Are there a lot of discarded packets? Is there a lot of jitter in there? It's very difficult to know with those kind of protocols because they were primarily derived for file-based transfer and then adapted to video, as opposed to SRT, which is constructed from the ground to be a video transport protocol.
Well, exactly. And as we start to move forward, we need different feature sets for some of these things. And again, those older protocols, RTMP obviously is the big one that's still wildly popular and commonly used for most CDNs and most stream publishing types, but it's hitting its limits. And SRT kind of has come forward as a good way, certainly at an enterprise level, for a variety of needs to solve a lot of the issues that RTMP was limited by. One of the ways it does this is with the kind of two-way communication, if you will. It has that sort of back channel of communication for diagnostics and packet recovery. And this can make a huge difference. It just, I can look at the stats I have and see exactly what's happening between my encoder here and where I'm sending the data to. I can know what the round trip time is, what my packet loss is. And all of these different pieces can help me determine whether or not I might need to adjust my intentional latency, or whether or not I have enough space to bring it down a little bit. So there's definitely a lot of features that are built into the protocol that allow us to really get it going to tune it, right? With RTMP, it's like, okay, you can tune your codec, but that's pretty much it. So as this slide presents, both Dave and I are using Epiphan Pearl Minis, our own product. Of course, this is an Epiphan webinar. So we are using Pearl Minis, and we are streaming SRT from our individual Pearl Minis to a Pearl 2 that is sitting in our studio space, which is in our office, which is probably more than 30K from where you are, Dave, but it's only about 10K from where I am. So I'm physically a little bit closer, but still it doesn't really matter. And basically that Pearl 2 is ingesting it and then streaming back out after some production magic on Cameron's part, streaming back out to Crowdcast. Now, we use Crowdcast for a number of reasons. It's a webinar platform. It's a very basic one. It's fairly inexpensive, and it had a tool set that we liked. There is really no other reason we specifically chose Crowdcast other than the fact that it was simple, easy to get up and running, inexpensive, and had the tools we wanted. There's no other reason we're using it besides that. People ask that all the time, you know, is Crowdcast your platform? No, we're just customers of theirs. Is there a partnership? No, we just found them, and you know, we wanted something other than something like YouTube that didn't provide real webinar tools. Crowdcast does do that, so we use it that way. But they don't support some of the more advanced things like SRT, so we have to use RTMP to get the stream to Crowdcast for you guys to watch it. So it's a little bit of a convoluted way of doing things, but Pearl Mini for me, Pearl Mini from Dave to a Pearl 2 over SRT, and then RTMP out to Crowdcast for you guys to view it. So that's the basic setup we have there.
And when we get later on, we've got a diagram where we show all of that setup, including how George and I are communicating and all of that. So we'll get back to that question at the end, where we really diagnose or dissect what we've got in our detailed setup. But one of the really nice things about SRT and what it allows us to do when we are connecting our Pearl Minis into the Pearl 2 that's in our office, we can, as George said, monitor what that connection looks like, how much packet loss is there, what the round trip time is, and then we can adjust the latency to kind of compensate or tune it to what the network performance is. So for example, if I have a large amount of packet loss or a very long round trip time, I may want to introduce more latency deliberately to give the protocol more room or more time, if you want, to do those packet retransmissions in case there's congestion in the network. So you really have the tools to go in and decide how much latency you want to trade off to get that quality. And so for George and I today, we connected up with Cameron a little before the show. We tested our connections. We settled on a latency that seemed to work really well for George's connection and mine. They're both very similar in terms of performance, and have been over the time we've been using it. So we found, the first couple times we tried it, we weren't really sure what to expect, and there were a couple little quirky surprises. But once we got used to it, we found we've kind of fallen into a very regular routine. We recognize kind of the performance that my home network and George's home network and the network between us in the office provides. And it's very quick for us to tune or retune. And in fact, I haven't changed my SRT settings in probably a month and a half. I just reconnect, I check everything's okay, and it's good to go. So it's a little bit complicated when you start. But that's again what we mean by advanced production. This is meant for people who want to go in, tweak some things, and get a better quality for those efforts.
Exactly. And so once you have that baseline, it makes it very easy to just reestablish and go. I've only had to change mine once, really, and that was a couple of weeks ago when we did a show, and we had some guests from some friends of ours at Bird Dog in Australia, and they were joining us through SRT as well. And because just geographically, it takes a while to get data from Australia, so we had to set a much higher latency for both of us to make sure that things lined up better and to get the correct error correction. So there, I think we set about a 500 millisecond intentional latency there just to make sure that we were compensating enough. Whereas here locally, we are basically all in the same geographic area. We can have a much lower intentional latency setting here, and be fine with that. And latency is another critical part of SRT. Not only does it give you the huge advantage of being able to manually control that for your error correction, but inherently it's a low latency protocol. So this chart that we have is pretty handy as quick reference for the common latency ranges you might see for different protocols. Really high latency, down into that typical, or even reduced latency, something you're going to see with another one of the very quickly emerging protocols of HLS. That's inherent to that protocol. It's always going to be fairly high latency. There's some other ones like Dash, and that's also kind of somewhere in the middle. Traditional RTMP usually ranges somewhere between 200 milliseconds and 30 seconds, depending on a number of factors, but totally uncontrollable. And then you have other things like RTP, RTSP, and WebRTC that are usually a little lower. Some of those not always ideal for internet routing, so not always a great choice there. And then you have SRT, which manually controllable. Like I said, even to get things to work between Canada and Australia, we only had to set a 500 millisecond intentional latency to make sure that everything ran smoothly. And that's a almost worst case scenario. So to give you that idea, it's like we can be at that and be still significantly lower latency than many of the other traditional protocols or other protocol options that are starting to emerge. But of course, we could crank it way down. We've experimented with things at the 80 millisecond range, and it'd be absolutely fantastic at that, provided your network is strong enough. That's always one of the big kickers, and you never know unless you do your tests and you figure out where your baseline is.
Exactly. And the other thing you need in order to kind of put this network together, or this SRT system together, is of course equipment that's going to support SRT. Yeah. SRT was developed by Haivision and kind of open sourced a few years back, about 2.5, 3 years ago now, with Wowza. They kind of jointly started the SRT Alliance and have done a really great job of bringing in a very wide number of members into that group, and not just a large number of vendors all in the same vein, but we have camera manufacturers, CDNs, switcher developers, all kinds of different products that you can imagine in this space have joined the SRT Alliance. And joining an alliance is very easy. The next step is to actually support the protocol on a significant portion of your portfolio. And I would say we're finally there in SRT land. For the first year or year and a half, it was a lot of people joined, but there wasn't a whole lot of product available that was kind of released and tested and available. And now we are clearly in that space where there are many, many products available. We could pick up cameras and stream directly SRT from a camera. You can find, Wowza Cloud and Azure and others are all starting to support SRT as an ingest. So it really is becoming part of the infrastructure, or the common infrastructure, and is no longer something you have to really go out of your way to find. And that's really was the tipping point for us when we decided, hey, we need to add this to the Pearl product. We were really waiting. We had a bunch of people asking, have you heard about SRT? Are you guys thinking about SRT? And of course we had, but we waited until we saw some critical mass. And when we saw that critical mass kind of take hold, that was when we really jumped in and said, okay, this is something we're going to need on our Pearl product, and we're going to need it, now rather than later. And so we jumped in a few months back and released that capability. And it just so happened with the timing of the pandemic and everything, it was kind of perfect timing for us, because as we were kind of forced to do these productions from home and forced to do them remotely, we were seeking a solution to be able to deliver high quality video. And this is kind of the picture that George was describing earlier. We have an even more detailed one coming later, but Very simply, we each have a Pearl Mini and a camera and a microphone at our homes. We're sending that over SRT into the Pearl, and then the Pearl 2 is being controlled remotely by Cameron. And as George mentioned, we're using RTMP to get to Crowdcast. If Crowdcast supported SRT today, we'd be using SRT at that link too. But
Exactly.
the critical piece here is the most sort of difficult section of the internet, at least in our scenario, is from my house to the office and from George's house to the office. And on those links, we're able to use SRT to ensure that we get really good quality into the production. And that way Cameron has some good quality video, very good quality audio to be able to put the production together. And then quite luckily, or not so luckily, strategically, we have a very good connection from the office so that we can get to Crowdcast or YouTube or wherever we need to go from there. But certainly we look forward to the point where we can go all the way from my house through the Pearl Mini to the Pearl 2, and from the Pearl 2 SRT to the CDN that we're using. So we'll get there. And we're starting to see, as I said, more and more of these vendors, whether they're CDNs or anything, coming online and offering SRT as a kind of standard fare.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things this allows us to do, though, is there's a lot of different use cases. This is the one that we're using. It's a fairly straightforward workflow once you've kind of seen it drawn out. But
Yep.
and in some ways, we're actually making it fairly complicated in the sense that we have, we're trying to have a very natural multi-presenter conversation for you guys. That's the more complicated way of trying to do things for sure. But even if you just needed basic contribution where you're just like the news, for example, you just have straight up handovers from host to remote participant or remote presenter and then back to the host, and they don't really interact that much. It's just a handoff. That's another place where SRT is great because you can have everyone running at the same time, coming into a central point where your producer, whether remote or maybe they're in the studio, but no one else is, can handle switching between those different things and then getting it back out to where you need to go. So there's definitely some great ways of being able to hand off to other contribution points or mix them together at the same time, which gets a little more complex. But it really depends on what your needs are. And how, the type of content you're trying to deliver. There's no right or wrong there. I don't think everybody has to have the full conversational content like we try to do. Some people are going to have maybe a keynote and then someone step in. Again, not to harp on it just because it's fresh in my memory, but much like Samsung does, they'll have, product manager X come up and do their portion of the presentation, and then it gets handed off to a product manager Y and they do their everyone could do that completely remotely using all of their SRT sources, coming to a central point and just doing those handoffs. It would be very, very easy. So again, from a contribution standpoint, using some sort of a source, again, we're using our Pearl Mini, but there are many cameras on the market now that are offering SRT directly. There's also software options. We're going to touch on these in a moment. But in whatever it is generating that SRT stream, getting it to your broadcast destination, and then doing whatever production you need and getting it out to your final destination. So hardware versus software here. Again, we're using our Pearl Mini, but Pearl 2 supports SRT as well. When you look at doing it hardware-wise or even directly on a camera that supports it, you're typically looking at something that is more reliable, fewer points of failure. Should something go wrong, if you're dealing with a piece of hardware, you're probably talking to a single vendor for support reasons. Oftentimes are more flexible and sometimes are easier to use for less experienced operators. And sometimes the setup is simpler. On the software side, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using software. There's some great software out there that is now integrating SRT. In some cases, not always, but in some cases, it can be a lower upfront investment. It's obviously more readily available since you don't have to order anything. If you just want to install OBS or install vMix, that's not a physical item you have to wait for, so it can be more readily available. And they, of course, run on, standard stuff, standard computers. Haivision has their own Play Pro app that you can use it directly from your smartphone, and we have experimented with that. It's pretty cool. I can go SRT straight out of my phone into a Pearl or another destination. Obviously, I'm still limited by what the smartphone camera does at that point, but it's an option, especially if I wanted to do something mobile over LTE. I could just be out in the woods as long as I have a decent LTE connection. So there's a lot of ways to do it with software as well. The general overall workflow and setup between hardware and software is virtually the same. It's just a question of what are you doing with this? So if we look at software, it's on a computer. You're going to need something like OBS or vMix installed that can generate an SRT stream. The content you're generating is obviously going to have to live on that computer as well. So if you're using a camera, like we said off the top, one of the things about pro production is hopefully getting away from things like webcams. So you're probably using a capture card with a high quality camera. You're going to need a decent computer to run everything. So by the time you tally all of those things up, especially if you choose something like vMix that has a cost to the software, you start to quickly approach the similar price to using dedicated hardware like a Pearl Mini. So, look at what's going to fit well within your workflow. And the big advantage of going hardware is usually multiple inputs, multiple simultaneous stream destinations, built-in mixing and switching, and sometimes easier to use. You could ship someone a Pearl Mini pre-configured and just have them plug it in and push go, right? So there's some big advantages to going hardware as well. So let's take a look at some of the other ways that we might use this.
Yeah, we've mentioned Pearl many times already in the webinar, and I think probably a large number of people watching are familiar with what a Pearl is. But for those who aren't, we might just take a second here and just talk about what Pearl is before we get into how you use SRT on Pearl. So we can just quickly set the stage with what is a Pearl. So it's our all-in-one video production system. So by that we mean it's a switcher, a mixer, a streaming box, and a recorder, all packaged into one facility. And as George spoke about, the vMix solution with capture cards and audio interface and a computer, and then the vMix software, you can think about all of that stuff all put together in one dedicated package. That's really what our Pearl system is, with a touch screen on the front for control and that kind of thing, and a much simpler interface. So it's really meant to bring those very common functions that you'd find in just about any production, whether you're switching, mixing, recording, and streaming. Pretty much if you're doing any one of those, you're going to want to be doing the others. And so this box brings all of that together and provides a simple way to operate that. I noticed we have a couple polls up, so maybe take a second and just visit those poll questions. We got a couple of them recently. One was, how often do you bring remote guests into your video production? And then which do you use for video production? Are you on the vMix and OBS with a laptop and grabbers side of the house, or are you on the, hey, I've got some dedicated hardware, or a mix of both? So lots of people are using one or the other depending on the circumstance. So those are the couple things we just want to hear about in the poll section is, have you brought in remote guests, and what's your kind of go-to setup for your live production? Is it mainly software based, or are you using dedicated hardware encoders on your production?
Just a bit of a tangent here. I just had to throw it out since I'm just noticing it in the back end here. Just to highlight why you might want to choose a hardware piece. Our producer's laptop crashed just a few minutes ago. Luckily, he's recovered and he's back in. But just to give you an idea, if that were me and I was running a software on a computer and it happened to crash, we'd be out. My Pearl Mini's running great. How about yours, Dave?
Yeah, mine's looking good.
So these are the things to consider. It can happen. As great as you think your computer might be, there's a lot more variables when you're talking about whether it's a Windows laptop or a MacBook or whatever you happen to be using. There's a lot more variables in a multi-use system than in a dedicated built-to-task system. So minimizing those points of failure can be extremely valuable.
Absolutely.
In terms of configuring SRT on a Pearl, And there's a lot of questions here in chat around different things of SRT, and we'll get to those, guys. We're not ignoring them. We're going to get to them. And maybe some of them will get answered as we kind of talk about this. But in general, it's really easy once you get the hang of it. At first, it seems weird because it is quite different from what you might be used to with something like RTMP. Because SRT has different modes, essentially. There's really three modes that we see with SRT: rendezvous, caller, and listener. And caller, listener, just by their names, it's pretty logical to figure out what they mean. One's a caller, one's a receiver. That's pretty straightforward, if you think about it from a phone call perspective. Rendezvous is the one we personally prefer and choose to use because it's very easy to just make 2 points, kind of meet in the middle and agree on things. It's great for traversing firewalls and getting through weird network setups. The downside is you do need to know a little bit more information because both ends have to know how to talk to each other. So in this case, if we're setting up a rendezvous, on my Pearl Mini, I have the address of the studio in our office, and the studio in the office knows I have to tell it my address so that they can essentially meet in the middle and rendezvous in the middle. So you do have to know a little bit more information. And someone did ask in chat earlier, if you have to set that up, how do you know your IP? Well, luckily that's easy. You literally open another tab right now and Google what's my IP, and it'll tell you. None of this stuff is secret information. You'll know what your public IP is from one basic search. You can also access your router and it'll tell you what IP address your ISP has assigned you. So it's really easy to find that information out, but it's not information that you traditionally would be worried about in these scenarios. But if you're going to do SRT with rendezvous, you do need to know it. You also need to decide what port you want to use, but you could basically make up anything that's out of the range of standard traffic. So it's not really a huge concern there. If you're up in the thousands, you're probably fine. So it's not a big deal. The caller listener is another great mode, but I find it's a little touchier to get running smoothly. Rendezvous, because it traverses firewalls better, seems to just always almost be as about as close to plug and play as you can get with SRT, I would say.
Right. Here we're showing just a bit of the UI to give you an idea of some of the statistics. So we mentioned that this is a transport layer that was written specifically for video. And one of the things that's built in is feedback from the receiving end back to the transmit end to let you know, what is the packet loss, what is the round trip time, so that you can set variables like your latency to accommodate that and to kind of make the most of the network performance that you have. So here we're just showing on the right hand side some of the statistics that you can see, and below that the setup, which is fairly simple. So you can see I've got a URL for, as George said, the studio Pearl 2. I need to know either a URL or an IP address for that. Plug that in. We need to agree on a port, and that's pretty much it. Then you can choose, different encryption key lengths if you wish, that sort of thing. But the setup, once you get your head around the statistics and set that latency measure, things are pretty easy once you get that first setup going.
Exactly. And we're looking at the statistics from this sample from a test run. That's not exactly reflective of exactly what we're doing today. That was showing us running a 720p test at about 3 megabit by the looks of it. But just to give people an idea, when I pull up that screen on my Pearl Mini at the moment, I'm at a 13 millisecond round trip time. I have a packet loss of 0.1% and a buffer basically of 0 because everything's running so well. My Pearl Mini is not having to buffer really anything at all. And I'm running at, because people have asked in chat, I'm running at 1080p at 4.5 megabit. And the other thing I can do, and this is a big thing, because other people have asked this and we'll kind of touch on this a bit, but we happen to be using H.264 as our codec over SRT in this case. The nice part about SRT is it's not specifically tied to a codec. It's kind of agnostic in that regard. But it also means that I can do things differently. I'm not limited by whatever the protocol supports. If I want to crank up my bit rate or reduce it, it really doesn't matter. My network matters, but the protocol of SRT doesn't really matter. And the big thing that that allows is that I can crank up my audio capabilities. You know, I am compressing audio. I'm using AAC compressed audio, but I'm able to run at 320K as a bit rate for that compression, which gives us a much higher quality audio from our production side. Even if we're knocking that down to send to the CDN eventually, starting as high as you can and bringing it down is your best possible scenario. And in this kind of setup, I'm able to do that. And that's a great benefit that you know, we're not limited by whatever our protocol or, you know, codecs can support. We can kind of break out from that a little bit.
Yeah, and just in contrast to George's statistics, I'm looking at my statistics currently right now at SRT. I'm a little over 3 times the distance, physical distance to the office that George is. My round trip time is around 27, 28 milliseconds, so about double what George is seeing. And my packet loss is all over the map, from down as low as 0.2 all the way up to 2.5, 2.6. Yet the quality is still very, very good. And that's what this protocol is good at, is we've chosen a common latency of 200 milliseconds so that my delay and George's delay are the same regardless of the networks that we're going over in the distance. And that is enough for it to compensate for a relatively high packet loss periodically on my internet between here and the office. And so it just goes to show George is on a much cleaner, shorter round trip time connection than mine. Mine's got way more packet loss, and it's variable. It's all over the place. I see it's down to 1 now. It was up as high as over 3 or 4 a few seconds ago. So it's really all over the map, and SRT does an excellent job of just evening all that out, retransmitting the packets it needs to, and managing the delay that I've set in order to accomplish that. So, it looks like a bunch of fields and a lot of numbers, but once you kind of get used to it and you see what it's telling you, it's fairly simple to set up. And as I mentioned, I haven't changed my SRT settings in a month and a half. I just fire it up, I connect to the studio, and we're off and running.
I think one of the other big advantages here is also that because we're using pearls, although our producer Cameron today is only controlling the pearl in the studio that's aggregating everything and sending it out to Crowdcast, in theory, let's just say Dave and I were uninitiated users and didn't have the know-how or understanding to configure this and get it running. With a pearl, through a system we have called AV Studio, it's possible to remotely control pearls through the cloud. And that means that if necessary, Cameron could actually have 3 different tabs open, one for each of the pearls, one in my house, one at Dave's house, and the one in the office, and configure and control everything on his own without us doing anything at all. That's entirely possible. You may not choose to do that, but it is actually possible. And it is another advantage of going a hardware route like a Pearl, is that you have the flexibility of remotely controlling every piece along the chain by one person if you want, remotely, without having to worry about things like remote desktop options or software or port forwarding or worrying about firewalls. There's definitely a lot of ways to do that. And there's a lot of stuff in chat about some of this stuff, and I think we're going to get to that here in a second. But there's a lot of great questions, Dave. I'm really looking forward to us diving into those. But this is kind of what we're talking about. If we're talking about setting this up in a professional way to do remote production, this is kind of how it can look. You start with a really high quality camera and good quality audio, get that into something that's going to give us an SRT stream and get that to wherever it needs to be. Maybe that's directly out. Maybe it's another mid-step along the way. But if you're using equipment that has the ability to be remotely controlled, your offsite producer can do all of that while you as the talent, or maybe you're the producer, whichever role you feel like taking on that day, can control everything and really allow the talent, if you will, to focus on what they need to do. The producer can focus on what they need to do and ultimately deliver the best quality content that you can. So with all that in mind, we did just put up another poll asking the question, does Perl seem to meet your needs from a streaming solution? Of course, if you're still not that familiar with Perl, that's totally fine. Obviously check out epiphan.com on our website for a lot more details on Perl specifically and all of its capabilities. One of the things to look at, of course, though, is, in addition to can it do SRT? Yes. People often ask, how much SRT can I do on a Perl? But also, what are some of the other options? I've talked to many customers that are getting more and more concerned about having encryption options for streaming. And that's another thing that SRT does extremely well. Normal RTMP is not encrypted at all. RTMPS exists, but there's not really much control over what it's doing. SRT not only gives you the option for encryption or not, but it also gives you the choice of the type of encryption that you're going to use in terms of, bit and setting your own passphrase and all these other kind of things. So from a corporate perspective, that could be extremely important. That might be mandatory, in fact. So this is another huge, huge thing. So if we break it down, Perl Mini and Perl 2 both support SRT encoding, so SRT output, as well as SRT decoding, SRT input. Both support 3 different levels of encryption options there from 128, 192, and 256. The connection modes, caller, listener, and rendezvous, are all options on both models of Perl. Really the only place where they start to differentiate is, and this is really just a system load scenario, and that's how many encoded outputs and how many decoding inputs each Perl can take. So Perl Mini, being the smaller, lighter weight box, we recommend a single SRT input decode, maybe from a camera or another system. That's based on 1080p. And then SRT outputs, if we want to send multiple SRT streams out somewhere, we've tested and verified it's pretty safe to do as many as 3, assuming you have the bandwidth to support it. On Perl 2, being the much more powerful, kind of beefier, bigger brother, it's 6 and 6. So this gives us a ton of flexibility. And again, when you think back to what we were talking about, where Dave and I each have a Perl Mini and we're sending it to a Perl 2 that's combining them and getting them back out, this is one of the reasons why we can do that, is that when we're having that multi-point, Perl 2 has no problem bringing in our two streams. We could bring in a few more and still be able to accomplish all of this. If we needed, let's just say, a 6-person panel for argument, we could be doing just a scaled up version of exactly what we're doing right now on that. So it would be very, very possible. So that's kind of the capabilities. Very, very similar between the 2 models. It's just a matter of simultaneous inputs and outputs, and as to which one might fit for your SRT needs. So let's get into some questions. There's definitely a pile of them. So excellent. I'm going to go through those here, Dave, and let's see what we can answer. For anyone who hasn't put their questions into the Q&A panel, please feel free to go ahead and do so. I may have missed them if they were in chat. So if you can put them into the Q&A panel instead, that would be awesome. Of course, there's also the upvotes in there. Feel free to use that. It's going to change the queue of which ones I'm going to look at, because I'm going to start from the top. So first one, this is a really easy one. Calvin was asking earlier, are the lower thirds generated using Crowdcast? No. Sorry, I'll go into a little more detail than that instead of being unfairly rapid fire on that. No, the lower thirds you're seeing that Cameron is popping up on the screen is being done at the Perl 2 production side. He's actually using an external titling software, New Blue Titler, to send in those titles actually over NDI to just complicate things even more, and being able to trigger those through New Blue to pop up over top. And using NDI means NDI alpha, so we can get that transparency and animation and all that kind of stuff. So no, Crowdcast is literally doing nothing but ingesting a stream and showing it to you guys. That's really all Crowd, and of course giving us the chat, polling, and Q&A panels. Other than that, Crowdcast is not doing any of the production side. The rest of it is all being done by Perls at different stages of our layout. Let's see. This is a good question, actually. ECM Tech. Oh, it got bumped by people voting. Let me go find that one again since I was in the middle of asking it.
Just while you're looking for that one, we have another poll up just asking, does a Pearl system suit your needs for a streaming solution?
Yeah, weigh in on that one.
So we just, gave you a brief overview of what Pearl is and how SRT fits in there. Let us know whether you think for your specific streaming needs, whether that's a solution that kind of ticks all the boxes for you.
Yeah. So ECM Tech was asking, how will multi-channel audio via SRT be supported and implemented in the Pearl 2? That's a good question, because currently it isn't really, and I don't believe we have specific plans around that at the moment, but we are looking at things.
Not yet. Yeah, multi-channel audio coupled with a single video channel is definitely on our list of things to add to Pearl, particularly where on the CDN side, where we're pushing up to a CDN, people want to hand out one URL and have the player that can support the user selecting a language or a different audio to go with that video. So that's something that's definitely on our roadmap. Don't have a specific date for it because there's a few things on our roadmap that we're implementing before we get to that. But definitely, when we added things like SRT and HLS Dash to our publishing protocols, that was definitely one of the key kind of use cases we had in mind. And we have had a lot of users over the years ask us, can we please get multiple audio coupled with one video?
Yeah.
So rest assured, it is on the roadmap. We'll get to it as soon as we can.
Yeah, but it's important to point out that although we don't have it there quite yet on the Pearls, it's another one of those big advantages of using a future protocol like SRT.
Correct.
That is something that would be impossible under RTMP. That will never happen under RTMP. So, going forward as SRT starts to gain more traction and be more widely used, some of these kind of features are going to start to accelerate, which is awesome. It's kind of a funny chicken and egg scenario. And Nick in chat kind of also highlighted another one, saying, can Pearl do H.265 to SRT? Sorry, Nick, the answer is no currently. We don't have H.265 on the Pearls currently. But that's another example. H.265 and RTMP isn't really a thing. So as we move away from RTMP and onto these other protocols, that's kind of been a roadblock for things like multi-channel audio, H.265, and stopping those from really being adopted. As we kind of free ourselves from the limitations of RTMP, hardware manufacturers like ourselves, CDNs, and everyone else can start to expand the feature sets that they can use, and we'll start to see wider adoptions of some of these, what was bleeding edge become more normal and realistic. So back to the questions. Richard asked here, this is a good one. I actually don't know the answer to this, so maybe you know off the top of your head, Dave. If not, it'll take some Google searching. But the question is Zoom in the SRT Alliance? They're looking to output SRT from Zoom. I don't believe they are, but I haven't.
No,
okay.
I don't believe so. And I know they definitely don't have that functionality in Zoom.
No.
I don't even think they're part of the Alliance. But I would have to go and check that long list of logos to be certain, but I don't recall Zoom being in that list.
Yeah, I don't.
Not in the
I don't
time frame
either.
when we joined.
No, and again, the SRT Alliance is 300 plus members and growing every day. But I haven't really seen any conferencing companies in a big way. There's a couple, but not. And again, just because they're part of the Alliance doesn't mean they're actually implementing. That's the other thing to keep in mind. There's lots of companies on that list that don't actually use SRT yet. So that's something. And based on the fact that Zoom is still struggling to get NDI done, we'll see about SRT.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. Microsoft was pretty quick to jump on the NDI with Skype, but we haven't seen the same thing with Zoom. They're still lagging on that front to get even the NDI there. I imagine they won't go SRT before they get things like NDI in place. So it may be a while before Zoom gets there.
Yeah, exactly. And some people did answer this. Dave Poole mentioned in chat here, I think Zoom can send out to a CDN though. Yes, but using RTMP. So they're limited to only using that currently, which again, if that's all you need, that's fine. You can definitely do that. But yeah, and again, I think the main difference there is the difference between conferencing versus live streaming. Although they're often thrown together under the same thing, they're not. There are different things, and we do need to recognize that purely live streaming and conferencing are not the same things, even though we talk about conferencing being streaming. It really isn't. So making sure we know which workflow we actually need is important, and then recognizing the limitations of both. Nick asked earlier, can you please list some of the equipment that will send out an SRT stream? So we did mention some of it, I think, after you asked this question. Obviously, Pearls, is a big one we're going to obviously highlight first. There are a number of cameras. I saw earlier someone in chat mention Panasonic cameras that have added SRT. That's something they've done recently. There are a number of other PTZ camera manufacturers that are doing SRT as well. Basically, if you start to see cameras that have NDI, chances are they're going to be adding SRT as well. So, kind of something to keep in mind, or some method of it. So Bird Dog's another interesting example. Their cameras are NDI, but they have their Bird Dog Cloud that can actually translate that to SRT. The camera itself isn't doing SRT, but there's a way of doing it. And so that's kind of a cool system too. Aside from that, there are some other encoders on the market that can do SRT. Wowza's own Clearcaster is another example. I can't think of too many others, but that's one. Again, it's something that's fairly new, so there's not a huge list. And then software, OBS, vMix, we mentioned earlier, both have SRT options. Of course, OBS, it's not natively in OBS. There's a plugin installed to make that happen, but it is possible. This is a great follow-up question. Someone asked, what CDNs are SRT capable? Wowza is the first one that comes to mind. Who else? Who else is out there right now?
There are a couple working on it, I believe, but I think in terms of just on their, call it plain vanilla service, Wowza is the only one I know of. I think in some of the services that you see built on the Azure kind of platforms, there is SRT support within kind of that Azure infrastructure, but we're not seeing it, straight on the front end of, say, a YouTube or an Akamai or that thing just yet. But I think that's going to come very soon.
Yeah, I think so for sure. And again, a lot of the members of that alliance are CDNs, although they haven't necessarily done it yet. And speaking to some of them, including our own partners like the guys at StreamShark, it's something that they're looking at. But kind of like what I was mentioning earlier, some of it is a little bit chicken and egg, right? The CDNs weren't in a huge rush to add SRT ingestion because no one was encoding and streaming in SRT. But now that that's ramping up in a big way, we're going to start to see that change, I think, fairly quickly. So, yeah. Let's see. Calvin asked, but I think we pretty much answered this, but what is your current setup? So maybe let's just go back to that slide, or we have another slide, I think, showing our setup, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this is the inevitable question that we know is always coming. So this is great, Calvin. Appreciate you asking it. This is what we're doing at the moment. We'll break this down because it can look a little weird, but when you're actually in it, it makes perfect sense. Dave has a Pearl Mini. I have a Pearl Mini. We mentioned that already. Both of those Pearl Minis are streaming to a Pearl 2 in our office. That Pearl 2 is sending RTMP out to Crowdcast for you guys to view. What you don't see is what we're doing as a back channel. And for that, we're using Zoom. Now, you don't have to use Zoom. Zoom really has nothing to do with this workflow other than it's what we happen to use as a company internally for meetings. You could literally use a phone call on your phone or Google Hangouts or Microsoft Teams. It literally doesn't matter. Just having something as a back channel so that all that's really happening in Zoom is Dave's sharing his slides that way. We technically didn't have to. You could run it into your Pearl Mini, but it gives Cameron a little bit more switching control doing it the way we did. But it also means that Dave and I are talking in more real time in that back channel to make our conversation more natural, so that if there were any weird latency or synchronization differences between our two Pearl Minis coming into that Pearl 2, it's not going to make our conversation as unnatural. That's pretty much the only reason that we really need that back channels. It just makes it easier. Plus, if Cameron had to yell at us for something, we'd hear it and you wouldn't. Yep. In fact, he just did that. So, that's that's the kind of thing where confidence monitoring and hearing that kind of back channel in the earpiece is super handy. And we're using Zoom to do that, but you can do basically anything as a back channel communication to your choice. But yep. The video and audio that you guys are hearing is all running from Pearls and SRTs.
Yeah, and you can, in fact, even use Pearls to generate those back channels if you wanted to. It's a little bit complex because you have to create a -1 mix for each of the participants, which means George needs to hear my audio and Cameron's audio if he's producing, but he doesn't want to hear his own audio reflected back to him. So it can be done. You could connect the encoders, the Pearl Minis, directly into Pearl 2 and have Pearl 2 serve back a feedback channel. We've done it and it does work.
It's a little more complicated.
It's a little more complicated, and it's just very simple to use something like Zoom. And as George mentioned, it frees us up to optimize the SRT connections going to the Pearl 2 for the production and not try to get the same kind of natural conversation out of that. So if we, as I showed earlier, my network's kind of all over the place. So we put a fairly high latency in, well, 200 milliseconds. I mean, it's not high HLS kind of high, but for SRT, that's a relatively high latency. We put that in so that we would have really good stability, really good quality of what you guys are seeing in Crowdcast. And then independently, we have this Zoom channel that we're communicating over, which if George freezes for a couple seconds or drops some audio or whatever, that's okay. We can still communicate through that, but we don't want our decisions of what we're using for SRT to broadcast to be compromised because we're also trying to use it as a back channel. So you can do that. If your network's very good, it works extremely well. But because our network is not perfect, and mine is particularly poor, it just makes it easier to separate those two things and say my back channel is one thing and independent, and then my SRT is the production flow that Cameron's going to switch and stream out to the viewer. So it just makes things easier to separate those. If you really want to go crazy, you can do it all with Pearls, but we generally don't.
Lee mentioned here in chat, he's like, but doesn't that double your bandwidth usage? Well, yes, that's the other downside to doing it that way, is it is going to increase your bandwidth usage. Obviously, Zoom is using a portion of bandwidth as well, but not as much as if you were trying to do all of those back channels and things like that. Now, if both Dave and I had equivalent network connections to what the office has in our homes, that would be a different scenario, but we don't. We're using, honestly, pretty average home internet connections. And I saw some chat earlier on, people were wondering about, what we're doing for our internet connections. We're not on some sort of corporate WAN or anything like that. Dave and I are just using our own personal, generic home internet connections that we had before pandemic, and we're still using, and we're managing to do all of this production over those. We do not have stellar fiber connections or anything like that by any stretch. These are standard. For any of the Canadians, I know there was a bunch of Canadians in the chat. I'm using a pretty mid-tier Rogers package. There's nothing special about it. So again, what I'm doing over SRT, there was some chatter in there about what CDNs do with NAT and all these other things. Another reason why Rendezvous is so nice is I literally did nothing on my router to make it work. I just turned it on. I didn't have to worry about port forwarding. I didn't have to disable my NAT or make any sort of special DMZ arrangements for my Pearl. It just worked. I didn't have to manipulate anything. Whereas if we were doing caller listener, somewhere along that chain, somebody would have to be playing around with firewalls and port forwarding, and that's not quite as great. So that's the advantage of Rendezvous. So anyway, next question. Wasim was asking, any ideas how to simplify the SRT piece from the source end? Example, I have a Pearl Mini at a presenter's home, which is going to connect to my remote studio. How do I get the presenter to know what their external IP is and open the right ports on the firewall to make the magic work? So as we mentioned earlier, finding out your external IP is really easy. Literally just search what's my IP and it's going to list it right at the top. Or you can look at your router and see what your ISP assigned. If you're using Rendezvous, you shouldn't have to change anything on your router or firewall or port forwarding. It should just work. That should be it. So, you know, that's pretty much all you should need to do in a basic setup.
Yeah, you have really two options there. If you use Rendezvous, then as George mentioned, you don't need to modify your firewalls, which is nice, but you will have to know the IP address of that Pearl Mini that you're sending to that remote guest. The alternative is you make that the caller, in which case you don't need to know anything about that network. It's going to call to you, but then you do likely have to do some port forwarding on your router in order to make that work. So either way, you need a little bit of information. You either have to do some work on your router to make sure that there's a port there that is forwarded through. And in that case, then you just send the Pearl Mini or the encoder to your remote guest and you need not know anything about their network. It's kind of a choice of one or the other. Yeah. But the nice thing is if you do go for the caller mode and you know how to modify the ports on your router to allow caller listener to work, then really all the person needs to do is plug in the Pearl Mini, plug in their camera and their microphone. And as a remote producer, you can log in, do all the settings, set everything up, the bit rates, all of that, so that they really don't have to do anything. So if you're sending it out to someone who might even be intimidated by, trying to find their IP address and provide it to you, maybe caller listener is the best option there. But you do need to do some port forwarding to make that work. Yeah.
So Mark asked this question pretty early on, but it's still there, so we're going to address it. You think Dave needs some tweaking on his fill light? And it's funny because we've spent the past week or so discussing some of these things. So maybe give us a really quick 10-second synopsis of your lighting conditions, Dave.
Yeah, so I don't have a fill light, so yes, it needs to be tweaked. What I have is basically a window on this side. I've got a blank wall behind me, and then I've got a piece of foam core that's providing a little bit of illumination on that side so it's not completely dark. But yes, it is a little bit kind of stark contrast. I will be investing in some video lights in the very near future so I get a more even kind of look. And certainly as we start heading later in the season, as the days get shorter, I'm going to run out of light in the late afternoon. So I'll need some proper video lighting to be on camera. But for the moment, I'm just using a large piece of foam core and my window. So it's a super simple setup, but it's not ideal.
Yeah, and I should add that probably the majority of days, your lighting has been fine naturally through that window. Today, here in the Ottawa area, the lighting is a little bit unpredictable. So it's that's a challenge because honestly, even the cameras don't know what's happening from one moment to the next. I am using specific fill lighting because I also use a green screen. Dave's is an actual practical background. So because of that, I'm more evenly lit just because I also have to light the green screen. So all right, we kind of touched on this one already. Which CDN are you using that's capable of handling SRT? They have 50 plus Pearl Minis, but can't find a live streaming provider that can't do SRT. So again, we kind of touched on this already. First, awesome that you have that many Pearl Minis. Congratulations, and happy to see it. Like we said earlier, Wowza is the only one that currently that we can think of off the top of our head. Wowza Cloud in particular is a great tool that many professional AV users will use. We have a number of customers that leverage them for their big corporate clients to deliver this stuff. And Wowza does have SRT. They're a founding member of the Alliance and they do use it. So that's where I would probably go, especially if you're looking at, you have that many units, you're probably doing bigger events and corporate stuff. That's probably the direction I would go, is looking to what Wowzer can offer you from a CDN perspective. Let's see. This is a good one. Favorite question for you, Dave. Edgar was asking, on Pearl 2, do you plan on being able to play videos from the encoder soon?
Again, that's one that is on our list of things to develop in the future. Media playback, and even, we talked earlier about the fact that we're using New Blue Titler to do those lower thirds and those dynamic graphics. Yeah, on the roadmap for Pearl, we would like to add the ability to do media playback directly on it, and the ability to do some titling directly on it. Again, it's not something that you're going to see from us in the next couple months, but it's definitely on our list, and we realize it's a very popular feature among our users to be able to do that. So it will come.
Yep. We addressed this one already, but Nick also had in here what software allows SRT. Again, OBS, vMix, there's probably a couple others. If you're looking to do it from a phone, Haivision's own app, and there's also another one. Somebody the other day mentioned another third-party SRT app for smartphones. So there's a few out there. You can definitely find them fairly easily. Here's another one. I know this is also a favorite question of yours. Steve was asking, will Pearl support HEVC/H.265 in the future? That's a tricky question, because some of that can be hardware limiting in some cases. Pearl Mini, no. Pearl 2 is undecided.
Yeah, we've looked at it for Pearl 2. I mean, in most of what we see our customers using Pearl 2 for, it's a multi-channel encoder where there's multiple things going on. And unfortunately, as you move from H.264 to H.265 or HEVC, it gives you roughly, half the bandwidth or double the compression, however you want to look at it. But it takes about 10 times the compute power to get there. So it's not a linear thing. And being a multi-channel encoder, we can do many channels at 1080p 30 using H.264. But if we were to move to H.265, it would be very difficult to do more than, say, one channel, and even there, it may not be the performance that everybody would like. So I would love to add that product or that feature to the product, but I think it's probably not going to happen unless we do it as just a single channel H.265 encode.
Or on the current hardware.
On the current hardware, yeah. So you will definitely see things in the Epiphan portfolio going forward that will support H.265, but I don't think Pearl 2 hardware is going to be the platform for that.
This is an interesting question. First time I've heard that, but also a very easy one to answer. Saul was asking, can Epiphan create an AVIO version that can output SRT, creating a simplified capture output for camera and audio? No. AVIO is not an encoder in any way. It's also not a network device. So there's no way AVIO could do that. That being said, if you're looking for a simplified single channel type encoder, stay tuned for stuff later in the year. We may have something right up that alley for you. On AVIO, that would be literally impossible, but there may be other options coming in the not too distant future. So keep an eye on all of our things, which is a good reminder to like, follow, subscribe, and do all the socially things on all the Epiphan things, Facebook, YouTube, and all those places, newsletters and all those kind of things to stay up to date on all the things we're doing. Yeah, we do also a weekly Thursday live show. I'm being reminded in my ear, which is tomorrow. And we always talk about all those kind of things in a much more condensed fashion than these webinars. So, Christopher also asked about HEVC on Pearls, so we answered that. And his follow-up was, would Pearl Mini be limited due to its CPU? Yes, exactly. It's pretty safe to say the Pearl Mini will never be able to do HEVC due to its hardware limitation, unfortunately. This is a good question that Nick mentioned. I saw it in chat much earlier as well. What is the maximum data rate for SRT? To my knowledge, there really isn't one, because it doesn't care. It's not a codec, so it doesn't care. So it really depends on the codec that you're wrapping with SRT, essentially. So if you take Pearls for context, using H.264, the maximum bit rate that Pearl can set is 50 megabit. If you're streaming in 50 megabit, man, I want your internet connection. But most people don't even come close to that. Even in 4K, that's about double what you actually need. So yeah, it's not limited by SRT. You could basically put whatever the heck you want down SRT.
Yeah.
Let's see. Mark was asking here, how do you leverage SRT to produce the pipe to each destination? Do you have to install software to utilize it? I'm not totally sure I understand the question, Mark. Maybe if you're still in chat, maybe if you could clarify it a little bit. But in general, obviously something has to generate an SRT stream and something has to receive an SRT stream. In our case, we're using the Pearls, but you could do it in the exact same style, exact same method with the software as well. But yes, obviously something that is SRT capable has to be involved somewhere along the line. Mark also asked, is SRT a setting in Epiphan products only? I'm guessing this was asked much earlier on. Absolutely not. We are a member of the Alliance, but as we mentioned, there are 300 plus companies that are members of the Alliance, and we are but just one. And of those, many people have products available that do SRT, whether it's cameras, encoders, software, CDNs, all kinds of different things. Chris asked a good one here. This is similar to the one that Nick asked earlier in some ways. Is SRT adjusting the data rate real time over the life of the connection? Again, no, not SRT itself. That's a codec question. In our case, we're not using a variable bit rate. Pearls are doing a constant bit rate encode, so nothing is adjusting it. So if you're concerned about those things, that's where you need to really know your network. We've chosen bit rates that we know by our own math is going to fit within the bandwidth capabilities that both Dave and I have in our homes. If we were struggling, and it has happened on some of these things where somebody's connection has been slightly weaker and we've had to bring things down to 720 and a lower bit rate in order to keep the connection as stable as we'd like it. But SRT is not doing that. That's a function of the codec and compression, and SRT is not doing that.
Yeah, in SRT, you're really providing through the latency setting, and there's there's an overhead setting, and you're really just carving out a piece of your bandwidth in that overhead to give the SRT protocol some guidance as to how much bandwidth to use for retransmission and that sort of thing. So it's not, as George said, it's not going to give you a variable bit rate. It's going to take a constant bit rate signal and map it out for you. And it's going to use your inputs of latency and overhead setting to know how much retransmission can it achieve and how much time does it have to complete that retransmission before your buffer at the other end is run empty. So you can tune the conditions for which it will work well, but it's not adapting real time within those conditions. You kind of set it up at the beginning and say, here's what I expect on my connection, or here's what I'm observing. And as I mentioned, my connection is kind of quite variable, but I don't get, 20% packet loss, and my round trip time doesn't go from 30 to 80. It stays in around 25 to 35 in a round trip time. And, I might get as high as 4 or 5% packet loss, but I don't get to 10 or 20.
Right.
So I can tune it to those worst case parameters and it will work within that, but it's not dynamically adjusting bit rates or things on the fly.
Yeah, exactly. So Mark did follow up here in chat. He's like, I think you answered the SRT questions. SRT is basically a new protocol to replace RTMP, etc., correct? And you have products and services that support it. Yeah, essentially. On a very basic level, yes, SRT is essentially a contribution stream that's going to replace something as a protocol like RTMP. It happens also have a whole bunch of features in it that have a big advantage over some of the more traditional protocols like RTMP, including the fact that, as we've kind of touched on a little bit, you can pretty much send anything you want over SRT. So there are companies that are playing with sending remote tally information over SRT, so that if you have SRT cameras in every corner of the globe with tally lights on them, all of that could be sent over that one transport. That's really the biggest value of SRT, is that it's not just streaming protocol like RTMP, it's transport, period. And anything you want to shove down it basically is going to go. So there's a ton of metadata and extra stuff that you could be piping through it. And that's one of the reasons it's really, really, really exciting, is that yes, it is essentially a point-to-point protocol, but the data you can encapsulate in it is what's cool about it, and how you can adjust for weaker and stronger connections and get all of the information you need. That's what's really cool. Which is actually a pretty good segue to contrast completely into the next question, which was, can I use SRT on popular meeting applications like Zoom, WebEx, Teams, and Google Meet? No, not currently. None of those platforms are currently implementing SRT. Most of those platforms are currently very focused on adding things like NDI so that you can get local network feeds into them and then out. So no, and honestly, I since SRT is much more of an internet-based protocol compared to NDI, which is a very localized protocol, I'm not sure that any of those big guys really are going to be all that anxious to implement it. Microsoft is on the alliance list because they're going to add it to things like Microsoft Stream and, as Dave mentioned, the Azure stuff. But Teams, not so much. Probably not. It's not. Why? There's no real value to them there. Where NDI is a totally different proposition. So I'm not seeing any noise about those guys looking to add SRT. Okay, so this is interesting. Yeah, so Lee kind of answers his own. The question was, does Pearl Mini allow for a PO return to the presenters from a switcher, mix minus kind of thing? And we did touch on that a little bit. He commented in his own question. He sort of touched on this already. Yeah, Dave, maybe somewhere you have that slide.
Yeah, I'm going to pull it up here if I can find it. So yeah, it is possible to do the kind of broadcast that we're doing today just with Pearl equipment, if that's what you really want to do. And what you would be doing is each Pearl Mini, if that's how your remote contributors are coming in. So George and I both have a Pearl Mini. We would send to the Pearl 2, and Cameron would configure a channel in the Pearl 2 from a video perspective that combines George and myself and the slides and everything together as a confidence monitor. And that would be sent back to George and I. The only difference is that when he sends it to me, the audio that he's going to provide to me would be George's audio plus Cameron's audio if he wants to whisper in my ear, and not my own audio. And then he's going to do the same for George. He's going to give him my audio and Cameron's audio, but not George's own audio. So he would have to create separate channels in the Pearl 2, one that gets sent to George and one that gets sent to me. They have the same video, but the audio is constructed individually for each participant so that you're creating a -1 mix for each of the remote guests. But absolutely, it can be done. The caveat there, of course, is that you need a pretty good network, because what SRT allows you to do is increase latency to accommodate for unpredictability in your network. And on that back channel, if that's what you're using for this kind of natural back and forth communication, latency is not what you want. As George mentioned, if we both had really, really great connections to the office or to the Pearl 2 that we're using for the production, we could absolutely configure it this way. But we don't have the kind of connections that would enable us to do that. We're using a 200 millisecond latency today. I think that's overly conservative. We could probably get away with 100 or less, but putting it to 100 gives us some safety in making sure that the broadcast signal or the crowdcast signal that we're sending to you has extra kind of, less risk in failing, because we're giving it that extra latency to do that packet recovery. If I was also using that as a channel to communicate back and forth with George, then our conversation would be a little less natural and we might be stepping over each other a little bit more. So it can be done. The equipment can absolutely handle it. The protocol can handle it. It's just a matter of whether the network you're going to implement it over is really has the performance that you would want in order to implement it that way.
Yeah. So Lee did have a follow-up there that he put in chat, just saying, I'm wondering about the Pearl Mini, comparing it to something like a TriCaster TC1 or TC2. I mean, yes and no. I mean, in the sense that they have encoding and streaming capabilities, but very different feature sets between something like the TriCasters and what the Pearls do.
Yeah.
And usability is pretty different as well, I would say.
Yeah, and I want to go back to this remote production slide as well. We mentioned one of the things that the Pearl Mini gives you is the simplicity for the end user to be able to just plug in a microphone and a camera, have a remote producer connect to that box without actually even knowing the IP. If you've already paired this with our AV Studio, as soon as they provide that network connection, it's going to call back home and the remote producer can go in there. And as someone reminded me while we were partway through the webinar here, you don't even necessarily have to have that remote guest say, what is my IP? Once you're connected with AV Studio, you can go in and find that IP address on the box directly and configure the SRT completely remotely. So that's one of the other differences, is that we've really constructed the Pearl Mini and the Pearl 2, not just with SRT, but certainly with SRT, to be a remotely controlled remote production kind of scenario where we're minimizing as much as possible what your remote guest would need to know and understand about, networking or AV connections or any of that. You literally want to just be able to send it to them and say, plug in this microphone, plug in this camera, plug in your network cable, turn it on, and I'll take care of everything else. And so I think that's one of the advantages, the simplicity of use of that box. And they have a touch screen right on top that gives them the confidence monitor to see, yeah, this is my signal. Or if you want, you can display kind of that feedback channel from the Pearl 2.
Yeah. So he did clarify again, he's wondering actually more working with the TC1, Pearl Mini to TC1, back channel to Pearl Mini. I mean, I suppose yes. We haven't specifically tried that ourselves. We don't have a TC1. And obviously we use our own equipment, but I mean, sure, why not? I'm not aware of anything that would prevent that.
Yeah, we did. I know about 2 months ago, maybe 3 months ago now, there was what they called a plug fest for SRT, where everybody kind of got together over a period of 2 or 3 days, and we just connected and reconnected a bunch of gear to all kinds of those manufacturers that are on that list of the SRT Alliance. I don't recall specifically whether the TC1 was something that we connected to, but we could certainly look back and see. But certainly in theory, if they support SRT, there shouldn't be a technical issue as to why you couldn't connect Pearl Mini directly into a TC1 and have the TC1 create a back channel.
Yeah, Lee, if you want to follow up on that with us, send us an email just to info@epifan.com, and we can chat with our guys who were part of that plug fest and see if they recall whether or not we interacted there. Certainly our focus during that plug fest had a lot to do with cameras. Obviously interacting with our device, but we did try with everything we possibly could. And again, this is a cool thing to plug the SRT Alliance. The fact that things like Plugfest exist, where all the members of the Alliance can get together and play these interop games just for the heck of it and see what happens, is something you don't normally see in this industry. And the Alliance facilitates that, and that's awesome. So yeah, if you want to follow up with that. So we still have a few questions here, so I'm going to try and speed up and go through them a little quicker. I may ignore ones that now look like duplicates. So Harry asked, I'm guessing earlier, do you both have fixed IP addresses at your home? If not, is it possible that your IP address could change mid-show? We do not have fixed IPs in our home, but generally and theoretically, that is a risk. However, typically speaking, your ISP doesn't change your IP unless you disconnect and reconnect for some reason, at least here in Canada. Obviously that changes regionally, but my IP hasn't changed in like a year. So I'm not overly concerned about it, but certainly that is definitely a possibility. That's where you might want to start looking at things like dynamic DNS instead of using IP addresses, or maybe having fixed IPs. If it's a business account, you can usually get a static IP from your ISP. So it really depends. But generally speaking, it's very low risk, unless they really don't like you. That used to happen here in Canada a lot back in the early Napster days when everyone was worried about sharing and server hosting from their homes. ISPs would rotate your IP for the hell of it just to mess with you, and that doesn't really happen anymore. So
Yeah, my IP's been very stable. The other way to get around that is to go back to the caller listener mode again, where if your Pearl Mini or whatever's on site is in the caller mode, it doesn't really matter what its IP address is. It's just going to connect to, the head end, and that's one way to mitigate against that. We're using Rendezvous because our IPs just seem, in theory, they could change, but they've been very, very static. Yeah.
So Christopher asked earlier, and we definitely have touched on this, but I'll just reiterate it because he asked the question in a little bit of a different way. Are the Pearl Minis asynchronously encoding and decoding two streams, or is there another system you're using for confidence monitoring each other? We are using a separate system. We're using Zoom in parallel, as we highlighted on one of these slides. That for our usage, although we could do it the way you asked, we aren't doing it that way, just due to the network stability. This is an easier way for us to do that confidence monitoring and natural communication.
One thing I'll add there is it also gives us a backup, which to date we've never had to use. But if for whatever reason the SRT connection went down from my Pearl or from George's Pearl for whatever reason, Cameron does have the ability to back us up and get us into the production through Zoom, and he can do that very, very quickly. It's just a matter of a quick switch at the head end. So using something other than that same SRT connection for the back channel also provides you a backup just in case something goes down there. Now, if your whole network connection goes down, it doesn't matter. But if for whatever reason the SRT connection or the Pearl Mini or something failed, you would have a backup if you're using some other mechanism for that back channel. So that's one of the other reasons we do it the way we do it, is we've not had to switch to it yet, but we have that as a backup just in case.
Yeah. The next question here was, do the Pearl devices support IPv6? Not currently. It also hasn't really been necessary in most installation methods of Pearl, so hasn't been overly concerning, since Pearls are typically not exposed to the internet. Running out of IPs of IPv4 is usually not a concern. So not currently. Were it to ever be an issue, I'm sure it could be easily added or done, but it hasn't really been a concern or an issue at this point. I'm going to close that one because it's basically re-asking the same question about how we're doing this stuff. When you talk about remote Pearl access, do you mean just via web browser interface? So Jason was asking that, and yes. So the Pearls in general as a network-based appliance are primarily controlled and accessed over a web browser UI. We have the option of pairing a Pearl to our cloud-based service that we call AV Studio. Once it's paired to that and you have an AV Studio account, you can create a secure tunnel from that cloud service to the Pearl's web UI that normally would only be accessible locally, and remotely control it as though you were local, but entirely through the cloud through a web browser. So it's very easy, and it also means basically anything can do it. It doesn't have to be a particular computer with any particular software. It could be a tablet or smartphone, a Chromebook, doesn't matter. Anything will be able to do it as long as it has a web browser. Here's a good question, and I did see some back channel chatter on this one. Can you go through the math to determine the latency necessary? So that can get a little more complicated, and we did have a different webinar where we kind of went through some of those more details. If you'd like, Eric, just because we are running short on time, if you want to send us an email to follow up on that, we can send you a it's has that information. It's it's not hugely complicated. There's some general rules of thumb, if this, then kind of thing. And so, it definitely helps to know some of that.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it's more of a lookup table
yeah,
than a pure formula, and really the only two inputs are your round trip time and your packet loss percent.
yeah,
So once you know those two numbers, you basically calculate the latency based on those, and there's a lookup table that says, provided your basically the percent package loss that you have. So take my connection has say 2% packet loss, that would give me a multiplier. That's a lookup. And
roughly 4. I pulled up the table here.
And I take that number 4, and I multiply my round trip time times 4, and that gives me the number I should have for latency. So for me, my latency is around 30 milliseconds, a little less. So using 4 as the example would put me up at about 120. And then we went a little more conservative and said, let's set it at 200 just in case my packet loss creeps up to something more like 4% or 4.5%. So there's a range of packet loss percentages that get translated to a multiplication factor. And then you just take that factor, multiply it by your round trip time. But send us an email. We'll be happy to send you that kind of formula or that calculation. It's pretty straightforward.
Let's see. Mick was asking, this is an interesting question actually. Mick was asking, will SRT work successfully with non-bonded cellular routers, i.e. load balancing routers? It should. I've heard there definitely can be problems with bonded since you don't have a single fixed IP, but no, but your IP would change if you have to load balance to another carrier. So probably not. I think you'd have to have a single cell connection for it to really work. You'd have to have a really solid single cell connection. I think switching and balancing between different connections would probably give you problems.
Yeah, we've never tried that. That's a good question. That's something.
No, I know it's a question we had a couple weeks ago, and I know it's something we're looking at experimenting with ourselves. But again, because there is that two-way communication, especially rendezvous mode. Like again, caller listener would be different, but in rendezvous mode, you can't tolerate IPs changing on either end, and so using bonded or balancing can do that. So it's not necessarily good for rendezvous mode, but caller listener, and it should be fine. But yeah, it does depend. And Nick just commented in chat, I do it on load balance with DNS and it does work. And again, it's going to depend on which end is on that and which mode you're using. And your highest risk would definitely be rendezvous using IPs. This is a great question, and luckily a very easy answer. Do you know of any instances where a Pearl was blocked, hacked, or ported to an unintended location? No, I don't. Absolutely not. That would be a challenge. Someone would have to, I suppose, hack and gain access to the Pearl. But again, Pearl, although it obviously sends things to the internet when you're live streaming, typically itself is not exposed to the internet. It's behind a firewall in 99.9% of cases. There are some customers who might gamble and put it in a DMZ, but if it's not, they would have to first gain access to your network, and if they've managed to do that, I think Pearl's probably the least of your concerns. But no, I'm not aware of anything like that. And I did see another question that was kind of similar to that we'll get to in a moment here. Nick also asked earlier, can you send SRT to Facebook or YouTube? No, not currently, because they haven't started using it as an ingestion protocol. Maybe someday, but not currently. What iOS apps can transmit SRT video? Haivision's own app, Play Pro, I believe it's called, and there is a new third-party one. The name escapes me at the moment, but there is another one out there as well. I've used the Haivision app on my Android smartphone. Works great. Some of my colleagues have done it on iOS. Also works great. So I would just use the Haivision one, but there are some others starting to crop up now. Mark, just kind of saying, I think this came early on. Why don't you use SRT to send out? Why use RTMP? Purely because Crowdcast that we've chosen as our webinar platform doesn't support SRT. If they did, we would use SRT. Here's the big question. This is the most difficult question that has been asked all day. And this is a great one for Dave and I especially. Leafs or Sens?
Well, Sens are out, so I guess the only hope is the Leafs, but that's a pretty meager hope.
Yeah, let's not go down that road. Thank you for this question, Steve. But yeah, that's a contentious topic in the Epiphan office. So let's move on from there. Kelvin asks, actually an interesting one. The gray background you're using, is there a specific brand, fabric, or color code? So the one I'm using is fake. Mine's a green screen that I'm keying, and I'm just using a gray background that I could actually change. Dave's is practical, but it's just gray paper, right?
Yeah, it's actually Savage something Thunder.
Love the color names.
Something Thunder. Yeah, it's just your typical photo roll paper that I got a long time ago. Something Thunder. Gray Thunder, I don't know. Yeah,
exactly. Anders asks, how do you provide audio return? I think we've answered that about 4 times now. Audio return we're doing in a parallel back channel through Zoom. So you're saying that in a case where enterprise IT will not port forward, rendezvous mode would work. Yes, Larry asked that. Yes, in general, it should. That's kind of the idea. And in our experience, we have not encountered any issues where rendezvous mode hasn't worked, unless we're choosing a port that is outright specifically blocked. So that would be the only issue, is literally if every single port is outbound blocked,
then you got a problem.
Then you're gonna have problems. But it's a pretty highly restrictive network where everything is outbound blocked. Remember, inbound, sure, but outbound blocked, you'd have to have some pretty extreme IT guys to do that. And so yeah, you might still have to open up some of that stuff if that were the case. But you don't need to open up inbound, just outbound. So here's the other question I was thinking of earlier. Scott asked, guys, an IT question here. Seeing as remote production via SRT in today's example used 3 Perl devices, each Perl device on the internet, do you ever run into instances where one or more of them is attacked or hacked to cause denial of service? Is there any way to prevent this? No, we haven't run into that. Again, we're very careful when we're doing these to not expose the IPs and addresses that are happening. So even in screenshots we've shown of settings, we've faked the addresses there. They're not real, or we blur them out. Someone would have to know those addresses to DDoS us, essentially. And we're very careful about that to make sure that doesn't happen. Honestly, if you're in remote production and something like that happens and it's a bit sloppy and someone finds out and attacks you, I mean, if they're doing a denial of service, there's not a whole lot you can do about that other than hopefully your internet provider, your router, or whatever equipment you have some sort of counter to that. But in general, no, I haven't really run into that ever happening. And preventing it is being careful, just like anything on the internet. If you're careful and you don't leak your information, you should be fine. Again, some of the things, this was true with RTMP as well. If you accidentally leaked out your RTMP key when you're streaming to YouTube, for example, man, that's just a mistake on your part, and you just need to be more careful with that kind of data. So, let's see. Kevin asked this question, does the confidence monitor show both participants or just the person you are speaking to? So again, depending on how you're running things, it can be yes, but the way we're currently doing things, again, coming back to it again, our back channel confidence monitor through Zoom, I see 3 things. I see Dave, I see myself in my own Zoom confidence monitor, and I see a third participant that is actually the studio, and that's showing the program out of the Perl. I can see that in Zoom as well for my confidence monitor. So I can see everything, but through our back channel of Zoom. If you're doing it in a different route, it can be yes, it can be no. It depends on how you set it up. We answered that one already earlier, so I'll get rid of that one. And here's another great question that we do see frequently, and it's our very last one, so we're going to shut this down at the end of this question unless someone comes up with something really, really good in the next 10 seconds. When switching between layouts, is it possible to use a fade rather than a cut as a transition on Perl 2? So currently, no. Currently, Perl only supports a cut between layouts. It is a very clean cut. You're not going to get crazy frame tearing or anything like that. And in the majority of production cases, that's more than suitable. That's what most people use in most cases, even outside of Perl. We have looked at potentially adding other transition options, and that is on the roadmap to potentially add in the future. Don't have a date to that, but like some of those other things we've mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things that we would love to add to the Perls. So stay tuned for those as we work on them. And we're always listening to feedback from our customers. So any of these things that you're interested in, that you're looking at as features, whether it's the questions around HEVC, multi-channel audio, transitions, video clip playback, any of those things, we love to hear that feedback. But one of the things that we would say is asking the question is one thing. An explanation of where it fits within your workflow to give us a better sense of how that makes sense helps. So if you would like to share that feedback with us, we would love to hear it. Send us an email, info@epiphan.com, and please provide as much detail about your workflow and why that feature is roadblocking that workflow for you. Really helps us to better understand it and helps us assign priority. If we tried to do every single feature that every single customer asked for, it'd be impossible. But we do add weight to those based on how many times we hear it and what it actually makes sense to. So again, if you don't mind sharing that with us, please do. We're always listening, and that does make a difference. So I think that will do it. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks Dave for joining us on this webinar as well. This has been a good one, guys. A lot of great questions, a lot of great interaction. So really appreciate it. Definitely stay tuned for future webinars that we have coming up. The one that we have next week escapes me. I'm sorry. I'm so bad at remembering.
I think the next one is how to multi-stream. So boost your live reach, basically. So how to get out there and reach multiple audiences at the same time or multiple platforms at the same time.
Yeah, so that can be a really good one involving multiple protocols sometimes. So that could be a cool one. And of course, we live stream every single Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern with Live at Epiphan, where we do shorter, more condensed topics about all things kind of around streaming and various different topics. Tomorrow's episode is about why your company should maybe be live streaming and what the value is of doing it. We're going to share our own insights and talk about the value of it from a marketing perspective. So if you want to tune in for that, tomorrow, Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern, we'll be here to chat about that topic. And we do that every Thursday on some sort of topic. So stay tuned for that. You can always keep track of us by following us on Facebook. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel if you like. Of course, our website, epiphan.com. Both future and past webinars you can find at epiphan.com/webinars. And there's a pretty substantial back catalog over the past 4+ months now of this stuff. So check that out. There's probably a lot of content there you might find interesting. So that'll do it for now. Thanks so much. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.